Okay, so today we're going to talk about chapter 2 of the Rachel's book, and this is the challenge of cultural relativism. So, again, remember, if you can't read these slides too well, they're going to be also on Moodle, so check it out there. So, cultural relativism is the idea that different cultures have different moral codes. So therefore, there is no objective right or wrong about what is right or wrong. We'll get to the argument for that in a second. So, but this is often where cultural relativists start, with this idea that different cultures have different moral codes. This is something that most people would agree with. It seems kind of obvious, right? Not every culture agrees on what's right or wrong about everything. And if you've ever traveled to another country, you might notice some differences in what people think is right or wrong. Maybe it's just little stuff, like people like to talk about how in Japan it's rude to walk around and eat. I mean, you could arguably it's rude here too, but other things that aren't perhaps that extreme you might notice. Rachel's in the book argues about presents some more extreme examples, like he talks about Eskimos, which is a word that we shouldn't use because it's not really the right word anyway, but anyway, he talks about how Inuit people practicing infanticide or various kinds of mutilation of women that's acceptable in other countries that is not acceptable perhaps here. But what if there are these differences, which we'll see that there's some perhaps less differences than we think, but what does this tell us about the existence of objective facts about right and wrong? Because I think that sometimes people take it to be obvious that if we disagree about what's right or wrong, then there must be no fact of the matter. But that doesn't follow. So the argument seems to be that, okay, people have noticed that there are differences in what people think is right and wrong. Therefore, there must be no objective standard of right and wrong. There must be no fact of the matter. There must be no truth about it. There must be some one of those things that, you know, we don't have any, there's no reason to make any judgment about. And so, you know, what people want to say is that, okay, rightness and wrongness are just like preferences. Well, I don't like perhaps a certain kind of ice cream. I can't think of one I don't like right now. But I don't like a certain food, and you do, and there's nothing wrong with that, and there's no reason to think that there's any fact of the matter about whether that food is good. But are pretty good reasons to think that morality is not like that, and hopefully by the end of this chapter you'll see why that's the case. But importantly, cultural relativists make a lot of different claims that are not all equivalent, though they're easy for people to mix up, and he talks about this in the book. So here are the claims that he says cultural relativists make. Different societies have different moral codes. That's one we just saw. A society's moral code determines right and wrong in that society. There's no objective standard that can be used to judge right or wrong in a society. The moral code of our society is not more correct than that of any other society, and it's arrogant for us to judge other societies' moral codes. These claims are not all the same. Some of them might be right, some of them might be wrong, and we're going to revisit these at the end of the chapter and see whether we can have some kind of insight into whether they are true or false and what makes them different. So here's the argument that is often made, though it's not the only argument for cultural relativism, it's probably the most common one. Different cultures have different moral codes. We already said that's probably true, at least up to a point. But then the conclusion is there's no objective fact of the matter about what's right and wrong. And again, this doesn't follow. It's not a good argument. And here's one way that we can see why it's not a good argument pretty obviously. the fact that people disagree about something doesn't mean there's no fact about that thing. This is important to understand. So look at any case you want to take where people disagree. One that just popped into my head when I was writing this is that people do disagree about who killed John F. Kennedy. Some people think Lee Harvey Oswald did it, some people think the FBI did it, I don't know, there's all kind of other theories, right? But would you take that as evidence that, at least on its own, that there's no fact about what actually happened that day? Obviously, there is a fact about what happened that day. If we could go back in time and, you know, or if you want to talk about a God's eye view, yeah, we don't know what happened. Maybe nobody knows for sure. Maybe we'll never know for sure. But if some objective observer who knew everything could know, there is a fact. So you could say, if you want, that God knows who killed John F. Kennedy, right? That means there is a fact. Now, whether we can know it or not is a different matter, but there is a fact about who killed JFK. Somebody did it, something happened, and there is a right or wrong about that. So the fact that people disagree just on its own is not enough evidence to say that there's no fact. Now, you have to remember, too, that just because this is a bad argument doesn't mean that cultural relativism is false, because you could give a different argument for it. So if you have a conclusion that, so if you have a bad argument for a conclusion, and we decide that that argument is bad, that doesn't mean the conclusion is wrong. I can give you a terrible argument for a conclusion that's correct, right? Just because I give you a bad argument for why the sun rises every morning doesn't mean that it's false that the sun rises every morning, right? I might say that it rises in the morning because I don't remember the mythology about it, but somebody drives a chariot, right, across the sky and pulls the sun up every day. This is one of the myths, okay? And I might argue for that's why the sun rises in the morning, but you would say your argument is bad, that's not why the sun rises, but you wouldn't say that the sun in fact doesn't rise in the morning, right? So you can give a bad argument for a correct conclusion. So we don't know that just because this is a terrible argument, that cultural relativism is false. But it is a bad argument because, again, just saying that there is disagreement doesn't mean there's no fact. So after this, he gets into what follows from cultural relativism. If it were true, what would that mean? Well, the first thing it would mean is that we could never judge other cultures' moral codes. And you might think that's okay. You might think that's okay at first. But when you start to think about it, it ends up being a pretty difficult thing to defend. Because it would mean that we can't say it's wrong for countries to allow the execution of women for adultery. We can't say that's wrong. I could give a lot of other examples of things that cultures do, that they say are okay, that's acceptable in that culture, that it is pretty vile. And I'm sure you could too. All you have to do is do a little Google search. You're going to find lots of examples of things that cultures do now and that they have done in the past. And you just have to think about Jim Crow laws, for example. Those were acceptable in American society in the 1930s to the 1950s or whenever they were enacted. Was that okay? Obviously not, right? So now this last sentence, any cultural practice, no matter how vile, would be immune to criticism from within or outside of that culture. So within or outside, wait, why? Because we're only talking about judging other cultures right now. But as it turns out, if you're a cultural relativist, you cannot judge your own culture either. Because if there's no objective moral standard, there's no basis for judging a culture from within the culture either. Now, why is that? Because what you have to remember is that on cultural relativism, good equals good in what that culture says is good. That is just what good is. You have defined good as being what that culture says is okay. If you define good that way, then you cannot say that anything the culture says is wrong, because wrongness and rightness just are defined by what the culture says is right. So there's no way to judge it from inside or outside. Once the culture establishes this thing as being right, it is right, because that's just what right means now. And this goes back to the first person to point this out that we have really in writing very clearly is Plato in his dialogue to Euthyphro, where he talks about good being what the gods love. And this is called the Euthyphro dilemma. So if you define good as what the gods love, then you cannot have an outside standard of good. Good just means what the god loves. And so in the same way, if good just means what the culture says is good, then there's no other standard of good. There's no way that we can say, well, hey, wait a minute, that we want to change this, or this is wrong. So you cannot then try to improve your culture even from the inside. So what this means is that not only was Martin Luther King wrong to criticize the society, it just didn't even make sense. Because if he says, well, forcing Black people to use a different bathroom or to not be able to eat at lunch counters or whatever is wrong, he's just saying something that makes no sense, because wrongness just means what the culture says. If the culture says that that's what should be done, then that's right. That's just what rightness means. So it's not only that he was wrong to criticize, but what he was saying actually made no sense. And that doesn't make any sense, right? This is an unacceptable result, because we can't say that, we don't want to, I think, say that, well, once the society puts it in place, it's automatically correct. That's not what laws mean. And it would mean that you can never judge your own society. And it would mean, importantly, that there's no such thing as moral progress. So we cannot then say that our society now is better than it was then, or that it was better then than it is now, because better only means whatever it is, right? So there's no way that we can, if we don't have a concept of good or better outside what society says is good, then we cannot judge our own culture or anybody else's. We can't have moral progress. Again, this means Martin Luther King was wrong. He had no basis for arguing that Jim Crow laws were wrong, because once a law is put in place, in that culture, it's right, and that's all that rightness means. So this really ends up being sort of incomprehensible. It just doesn't make any sense. So cultural relativism really just kind of doesn't make sense when you really think about it. And that's part of the problem with the view. It's not only probably morally problematic, it just also doesn't make sense. Okay, and then Rachel talks about whether the disagreement between cultures is really that extreme. So he says many of the differences between supposed differences in moral codes aren't actually differences in the belief about what's right and wrong, but different beliefs about factual matters. His discussion of eating beef in Hindu culture is really not quite right, but the point is that it's not so much that we disagree on what is right about whether it's right to eat meat or whether it's right to eat cow. It's just they have different beliefs about what cows are and what they symbolize. And so we all think that sacred things should not be defiled, and that you could argue is a common moral belief between, say, Christians and Hindus, for example. And so it's just the disagreement is more about what is sacred rather than what you should do about sacred things. So you can kind of say that, well, some of these disagreements seem like they're bigger than they really are, you know. So, and I do think though that there are bigger disagreements between cultures that are pretty extreme, especially when it comes to the treatment of women and children. And I think those are a little harder to bridge the way he wants to. But what he does want to say is that there are core moral beliefs that every society must agree on. And the reason for that is partly just practical. Like if you had a society that did not prohibit murder, for example, the society would quickly fall apart. Stealing and lying are things that really kind of tear apart societies, and so they have to have agreement on those moral beliefs. So, but it is true also, I think, that some of the perceived extreme differences in moral codes are due to cultural misunderstandings, and he talks about that with the whole Inuits and the supposed infanticide that goes on. It's not clear that goes on very often, and then there are reasons for it, and he talks about this in the book. So maybe the differences between cultures aren't that extreme anyway, but I think he spends a bit more time on this because it doesn't, a bit too much time on that because it doesn't really matter. Because again, we saw that argument's no good anyway. The argument from differences in moral culture to moral codes in different cultures to the fact that there is no objective moral standard is a lousy argument anyway. More importantly, should we be able to judge other societies on our own? And here he kind of circles back to saying that in some ways cultural relativism is a good thing. It does encourage us to be more tolerant, which is certainly not a bad thing, that we should be more tolerant of other cultures, and we should think carefully before morally judging them. In the, let's see, I'd say like the 16th to the 1800s especially, maybe even earlier, European cultures really liked to go into less developed countries and tell them how they should live and really, judge their primitive beliefs in various kinds of ways and decide that they were morally wrong and try to change them. And this was obviously a bad thing. And so I think sometimes people want to embrace cultural relativism because they want to reject that kind of thinking that especially Europeans can go in and fix everything. But going too far the other way to this extreme cultural relativism is also a bad thing because it ends up becoming the idea that we should tolerate anything even if it's intolerant. So if the standard is that we should be tolerant and that we should be understanding, if we do that across the board, it ends up being that we're going to tolerate, like I said, things like the abuse of women and children. You can take obvious examples like Nazi Germany. If we're going to say that we can't judge other cultures, then we can't judge the Nazis who were intolerant. So are you going to tolerate intolerance, right? And it ends up, again, being pretty incomprehensible in the end. So taking that extreme cultural relativist view is going to just lead to stuff that makes no sense. So even though it's difficult to find a moral standard that, as we'll see in this whole class, that can apply to everything and that can work really well and not fall into this idea of just judging other cultures without really understanding them, we still need to have that, I think, as a goal. Because we do presumably want to live better lives, have other people live better lives, and promote the flourishing of philosophers like to talk about human flourishing, but we want to promote, I hope, the flourishing of the entire planet. And if we're going to do that, I think we do need to search for the best way to do that. And the only way to do that is to accept that, yes, there is a right and wrong. That's not just tied to any particular culture. So here at the end of the chapter, then, he returns to these claims that we outlined earlier, that cultural relativism makes, and tries to evaluate them after all this discussion. So the first one, different societies have different moral codes. Okay, this is true. But as he has argued, most, if not all, societies agree on some basic values, and again, they must in order to function. You would not be able to have a society that functioned where anyone could just go kill anybody else anytime they wanted to. Things would just fall apart. You can't, as we'll see later when we talk about Kant, you can't have lying just be normal, because if lying is normal, nobody believes anyone's lies. You can't have a store if anyone's just allowed to steal anything all the time. So there have to be some basic values that every society agrees on, even just as a practical matter. But it is certainly true that there are different moral codes for different societies. So that claim of cultural relativism is probably true. But what about this one? The moral code of a society determines right or wrong in this society. And again, this just cannot be true, because societies, like individuals, can be right or wrong about morality. And that's why we try to improve our society, and that's why we sometimes, condemn other societies for doing things like stoning people. A society that advocates foot binding for women or stoning women for adultery are wrong. Those actions are just wrong. And to say, well, that society says it's okay, so it must be okay, is just wrong. It's just not right. And there's no real getting around that by saying, well, that society says it's okay. No, it is just wrong to stone people because you don't like what they did. It's just wrong. So I just don't think that this is a sustainable view right here. And that leads into this one, which is also unsustainable. There's no objective standard of right and wrong. It's clearly difficult to come up with a standard of right and wrong that is going to be perfect, but that doesn't mean there isn't one. And again, if there weren't an objective standard of right and wrong, we would not be able to say that our culture or other cultures are wrong about anything, and that's clearly unacceptable. Because again, then we would have to say that when Jim Crow laws were in place in the United States, they were okay. There was no reason to change that. We would have to say that there's no reason why a country can't cut off someone's hand for stealing, that that's acceptable. And so this is clearly not something that we can reasonably believe. This one is a little different. This claim is a little harder. The moral code of our society has no special status and is not better than any other. It's true that our society, anybody's society, is not automatically better than others, even though we might think it is. It might be better in some ways and worse in others. But to say that all moral codes are equally good is to deny there's a standard of right and wrong, but as we have seen, that's not acceptable. You cannot say, well, each moral code is equally good. If one allows the stoning of women for adultery, that moral code, at least in that particular way, is worse than one that does not do that. And I don't think there's any way to reasonably believe that yes, it's just as good to have a moral code that allows the stoning of women, or that allows people to be enslaved, or any of those things that you want to come up with, that moral code is just as good as a moral code that doesn't allow that. So, so this is clearly also a false claim. It's arrogant to judge other cultures. And again, yes, we don't want to say that the European countries that would go in and call these primitive cultures worse than them without really understanding them and, just automatically say that our culture is better that was clearly a bad thing. We should be careful in judging all other cultures, but to say we never can is clearly going too far. And again, if we were never to judge other cultures or our own, we would be tolerating the suffering of innocent people within whatever that culture is. And we wouldn't be able to say things like slavery is wrong. So this kind of claim is just ignoring the subtleties of what judging other cultures really means and what it means to judge, in fact, our own culture as well. So there you have it, chapter 2, cultural relativism, and the reason why we always do, pretty much in ethics classes, I always do a chapter on this, is because a lot of people come into ethics thinking that there is no objective fact of the matter, and therefore the whole thing is a waste of time. But as we've seen, the view that there is no right and wrong is really not only unsustainable, but also not very consistent. So it seems like we need a starting point where we agree that there is something called right and wrong that isn't just defined by somebody's culture, that there's something outside that culture that we can point to and say, okay, this is the standard we want. And again, we may not find what that thing is, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't exist or that the search for it is a waste of time. So there we go, chapter 2 in the bag.